Every morning, before the markets opened, the same man stepped out of the same building in Lower Manhattan. He walked past the newsstands and the coffee carts and stopped at the same payphone on the same corner. He dropped in a coin. He dialed a number he knew by heart. And when the voice on the other end answered, he said 3 words. It's Howard Cohen. There was no Howard Cohen. The name was fake, but the information that followed was real. Real enough that by lunchtime, someone would be richer by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Behind him on the building, the Wall Street Journal logo caught the morning light. He glanced up at it once, hung up the phone, and walked back inside. To understand what was on that phone call, you have to understand what was inside that building. Every weekday, on an inside page of the Wall Street Journal, ran a newspaper column called Heard on the Street. It was not long, it was not flashy, but on Wall Street, it mattered. This was the early 1980s. There was no round-the-clock financial news on CNBC. There was no internet, no smartphones. For investors, brokers and fund managers, the Heard on the Street column in the Wall Street Journal was one of the most popular sources of financial information. The column picked a company, looked at its prospects, and then told the country's investors what to think. If a company got a favourable mention, a stock could climb the moment the paper hit the street. A negative comment, and the same stock could collapse before lunch. And whoever knew what was going into it each morning was sitting on something far more valuable than anything they could ever get by writing it. The man who walked back inside had a name: R. Foster Winans. He was 35 years old, and he was a co-writer of Heard on the Street. He earned about $25,000 a year. The same hand that wrote tomorrow's column had just dialed this morning's phone. Inside the newsroom, Winans understood perfectly well how much clout that the column carried. One of his editors, Stuart Pinkerton, had even put it in writing. Readers rely on Heard on the Street for insight, for accuracy, and for integrity. If that trust starts to break down, it would be a serious problem, especially for a column powerful enough to move markets. Winans had read that warning. He kept writing the column, and every morning, he kept making that call. To understand how a co-writer of Heard on the Street ended up at a payphone, you have to go back to a golf course on Long Island. October the 16th, 1983. Meadowbrook. Winans was there with a man named Peter Brandt. Brandt was 30 years old and the top broker at Peabody, one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. The year before, he had pulled in $1.8 million in commissions. Brandt's pitch to Winans was simple. "That column you write is very powerful," he said. "It moves stocks. You're doing a great job, and they only pay you $25,000 a year. If you told me what you were going to write the day before it ran, we'd make a lot of money." Winans said yes. He knew that it was wrong, but he said yes anyway. The scheme had a routine. Late at night, or early in the morning, Winans and his co-writer would decide which company they would cover. Then they decided on the tone, positive or negative. Winans would leave the building, walk to the payphone, drop in a coin, and say the name. It's Howard Cohen. And on the other end of the line, Peter Brandt would listen. Then he would start placing trades, sometimes for himself, and sometimes for his colleague, Kenneth Felis, and sometimes for a client named David Clark. By the time the column hit the street, the trades were already in, and by the time the market reacted, they were already getting out. Over roughly 4 months, they traded on about 27 articles. The court would later put the total profits at close to $690,000. Winans' personal cut was about $30,000, more than his annual salary, but a fraction of what the brokers were keeping. One payment came as a $10,000 check. On the memo line, in pen, someone had written a single word: drapes. Their morning routine had become a money-making machine. Write a short article, make a quick phone call, place a trade, and then profit. It was almost too easy, but every morning routine leaves a pattern, and someone was about to notice it. They thought they were covering their tracks. They weren't. The very first trade was enough. October the 17th, 1983. A bet on a company called Schlumberger. This was not a quiet little stock purchase. It was an aggressive options play, the kind of trade that leaves fingerprints. At the American Stock Exchange, automated surveillance flagged it almost immediately. And inside Kidder Peabody, where Brandt and Felis both worked, the firm's own compliance department began digging. They pulled the records, checked the dates, and matched the trades with the Wall Street Journal articles. And by November the 3rd, less than 3 weeks after the handshake at Meadowbrook, they had seen the pattern. Brandt and Felis kept trading again and again. The money machine was still running, but now someone was watching. When compliance started asking questions, Brandt and Felis had a choice: stop, come clean, or walk away. They did none of that. They lied. They told Kidder Peabody, their own firm, that their trades had no connection to the Wall Street Journal. And then they doubled down and kept going. But now they had a problem. The account that they had been using was too exposed. So they paused the trading, shut down the account, and opened another one. Not in New York, in Switzerland. The new account was held under a shell company called Western Hemisphere Trade Corp No. 2. Through that account, they moved roughly $275,000. Now that the money was further away from their firm's compliance department, they started trading again. The money machine was back up and running, but their compliance team was no longer the only problem. By early 1984, the SEC was asking questions too. On March the 1st, SEC investigators began questioning Winans. They asked whether he was using a brokerage account in someone else's name. They also asked whether he had received money from Brandt. Winans said no. 3 weeks later, the group met at Trader Vic's, the bar inside the Plaza Hotel. They drew up fake invoices for decorating work, trying to give the payments a cover story. By then, the scheme was no longer just a secret. It was a cover-up. And cover-ups have a habit of collapsing. For 28 days after lying to the SEC, Winans said nothing. Then, on March 29, 1984, he went back to the SEC and confessed. No plea deal, no formal charges, and no guarantee that telling the truth would save him. He simply sat down with investigators and told them everything. The articles in the Wall Street Journal, the fake name, the payphone, the money, the Swiss account, and the fake invoices. The cover-up was finally over, but a confession is not the same as escape. Within days, the Wall Street Journal fired him. He was 36 years old. He had lost the job and the only profession he had ever practiced. But losing his career was the least of his problems. He now had to face justice, and the courtroom was waiting. The trial began in January 1985. There was no jury. Winans and the others had agreed to be tried by one federal judge, Charles E. Stewart. Over 20 days, the case came down to one basic idea: trust. The prosecution said the Wall Street Journal had rules. Reporters were not allowed to trade on confidential information. They were not allowed to leak it. And Winans, they argued, had broken that trust. He had taken the journal's unpublished words that the newspaper had not yet shown the public, and turned them into money. Then on the second day of trial, the defense found an awkward detail. Stuart Pinkerton, one of the Wall Street Journal's editors, was asked about their conflict of interest form. Had Winans ever signed it? No. Why not? Well, because no one had asked him to. Of course, that did not make the scheme clean, but it did leave an uncomfortable question hanging in the room. If the journal's own rules were so important, why had the journal never made him sign them? But the missing signature was only one detail. The bigger question was still waiting for Judge Stewart. Had Winans simply broken his employer's rules, or had he committed a federal crime? After 20 days of testimony, the courtroom went quiet. The judge was about to deliver his verdict. On June the 24th, 1985, Judge Stewart issued his 45-page decision. He found that the scheme had been deliberate. Winans was found guilty on 59 criminal counts, including securities fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Kenneth Felis was convicted on 41 counts. Others were convicted too. 6 weeks later, the sentences came down. Winans was given 18 months in prison, a $5,000 fine, 5 years probation, and 400 hours of community service. At the time, it was reported as one of the stiffest insider trading sentences handed down in Manhattan Federal Court. And then there was Peter Brandt. Brandt was the broker who had pitched the scheme and placed the trades. Brandt was the one who took the lion's share of the $690,000. But Brandt had testified for the government and pleaded guilty before trial. His sentence was 8 months, and he was allowed to serve it on weekends. Winans went to a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, and Brandt went home on Sunday nights. Winans appealed. Yes, he had leaked the journal's articles before publication date. Yes, brokers had traded on them, but was that really insider trading? At the time, insider trading law was mostly built around company secrets. Example: an executive knows a takeover is coming and he makes a trade before ordinary investors find out. But Winans' situation was different. He was not an insider at the companies being traded, and he had no insider knowledge of what was going on in those companies. The only secret he stole belonged to the Wall Street Journal. He knew what the paper was about to publish. And because his articles could move prices, that secret had value. So prosecutors in this case had used a broader idea: misappropriation theory. In plain English, if someone trusts you with confidential information and you secretly use it to trade stocks, that can be securities fraud, even if the information did not come from the company being traded. And that was how the prosecutors had turned a newsroom betrayal into an insider trading case. But Winston's defense team said no, not so fast. They argued that the government was stretching the law too far. Maybe this was fraud, maybe it was betrayal, but that did not automatically make it insider trading. In May 1986, 3 appeal judges heard the case. 2 sided with the government, and only 1 sided with Winans. So Winans lost the appeal 2-1. And that split mattered, because if one appeal judge thought the law had gone too far, maybe the Supreme Court would too. So Winans appealed again, this time to the highest court in America. In 1987, Winans' case reached the Supreme Court. Normally, the Supreme Court has 9 justices, but Justice Powell had retired, and so for this case, there were only 8. On one question, the 8 justices all agreed. The Wall Street Journal's unpublished columns were valuable property, and Winans had helped exploit them, so the mail and wire fraud convictions stayed. But on the bigger question, was this insider trading, the court split 4-4. So there was no majority, no clear ruling, no final answer from the highest court in the country. And since a tie leaves the lower court ruling in place, Winans still lost. His previous conviction stood. He went to prison while the law around his case remained unfinished. He served roughly 9 months at Danbury Federal Prison Camp, and he was released in September 1988. He went back to writing, mostly as a ghostwriter. But the legal question did not disappear. And then 10 years later, in another case, United States versus O'Hagan, the Supreme Court finally said yes. Yes, stealing confidential information from someone who trusts you and then secretly using it to trade stocks can be securities fraud. You do not have to be an insider at the company being traded. The law finally caught up with the question that Winans' case had left behind. Outside the old Wall Street Journal building, the corner where he used to make those calls is still there. The payphone is gone now, and there is no Howard Cohen, but there never was.